In 1997, a perfectly orchestrated truck heist in downtown Toronto vanished $2.4 million in under 12 minutes. No witnesses stepped forward, no suspects were named, and no evidence survived the scene. The case file gathered dust for over 2 decades while the money disappeared into the city's underground economy. But in 2023, during a routine maintenance inspection at a long-abandoned gas station on the outskirts of Scarborough, a mechanic discovered something buried beneath decades of rust and neglect. What he found wasn't the missing cash, but it was enough to crack open a case that law enforcement had written off as unsolvable. What began as a simple fuel system check became the key to unraveling one of Toronto's most disciplined criminal operations. On the morning of November 14, 1997, a Brinks armored truck departed from the Bank of Montreal's main processing facility in downtown Toronto, carrying federal tax collections from across Ontario. The vehicle followed its standard route along King Street, making scheduled stops at 3 additional pickup points before heading to the secure transfer facility at Pearson International Airport. Inside the reinforced cargo compartment were canvas bags containing $2.4 million in cash, mostly small bills collected from retail businesses and government offices throughout the Greater Toronto Area. The truck was staffed by 2 armed guards, both with over 5 years of experience in secure transport operations. Neither had any criminal history, and both had passed recent background screenings without incident. The operation that intercepted them was executed with surgical precision. At exactly 11:47 a.m., as the truck approached the intersection of Bay and Adelaide, traffic began to slow due to what appeared to be a minor collision between 2 sedans blocking the eastbound lanes. The Brinks vehicle, following protocol, remained in its lane and waited for the obstruction to clear. What the guards didn't realize was that the accident had been staged specifically to create this moment of vulnerability. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Within seconds of the truck coming to a complete stop, 4 individuals emerged from the disabled vehicles. They moved with coordinated efficiency, wearing identical Navy coveralls and reflective safety vests that made them appear to be city maintenance workers responding to the scene. 2 approached the driver's side while the others positioned themselves at the rear cargo doors. The lead man carried what looked like a standard clipboard and approached the driver's window with the casual confidence of someone conducting routine business. The driver, following company procedure, cracked his window slightly to communicate with what he assumed was a traffic control officer. Instead of questions about the delay, he was met with the barrel of a compact pistol pressed against the glass. The instruction was simple and direct. Unlock the doors and step out of the vehicle. No shouting, no panic, just quiet professional control. The second guard, monitoring the situation from the passenger seat, reached for his radio but froze when he saw a similar weapon aimed at his side of the truck. Both guards complied immediately. They were escorted to the rear of the vehicle where they were ordered to open the cargo compartment using their security keys. The entire process took less than 4 minutes. The bags were transferred to a waiting panel van that had appeared on the scene disguised as an emergency response vehicle. Its sides displayed the logo of a legitimate electrical contractor, complete with authentic-looking permits and city inspection stickers. To any passing motorist, the scene looked like a standard traffic incident being handled by municipal workers. The guards were secured with plastic zip ties and placed in the back of the van, not as hostages but to prevent them from immediately alerting authorities. They were driven approximately 8 blocks to a parking garage underneath a commercial building, where they were released unharmed with their restraints cut. By the time they reached street level and contacted police, the stolen truck had already been abandoned in a different part of the city, and the crew had vanished without a trace. The initial police response was swift but ultimately fruitless. The abandoned Brinks truck was found less than 30 minutes later in a shopping center parking lot. completely empty and wiped clean of fingerprints. The two sedans used to create the traffic obstruction were discovered to be stolen vehicles, reported missing from different neighborhoods earlier that week. Both had been stripped of any identifying evidence and showed no signs of the collision damage that had supposedly disabled them at the intersection. Investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses who had been present during the incident, but their accounts were remarkably consistent in their lack of useful detail. Most described seeing what appeared to be city workers handling a routine traffic problem. The coveralls and safety equipment had been so convincing that even trained security cameras in nearby buildings had recorded the scene without triggering any alerts. The perpetrators had understood exactly how to blend into the urban environment, making themselves invisible in plain sight. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal authorities joined local police due to the involvement of government tax revenues. Over 40 detectives were assigned to the case, conducting interviews with hundreds of individuals connected to the armored car industry, city maintenance departments, and known criminal networks throughout the Toronto area. They examined employment records, vehicle registrations, and financial transactions looking for any pattern that might reveal the identity of the crew. What emerged from months of investigation was a portrait of meticulous planning and professional execution. The timing of the heist had been calculated to exploit a specific vulnerability in the Brinks route schedule. The intersection where the robbery occurred was chosen because it provided multiple escape routes while being far enough from police stations to delay immediate response. The fake accident had been staged using vehicles stolen from locations that wouldn't be missed for several hours, giving the crew time to complete their operation before theft reports were filed. The crew's knowledge of armored car procedures suggested inside information or extensive surveillance. They knew exactly how the guards would respond to a traffic situation, which protocols would be followed, and how long they had before backup would arrive. This level of preparation indicated that the robbery had been planned for months, possibly longer, with careful attention paid to every detail that could determine success or failure. Despite the scope of the investigation, no arrests were made in the first year following the heist. The crew had left behind no physical evidence that could be traced to specific individuals. No informants came forward with useful information, and no suspicious financial activity was detected in the weeks and months that followed. The money seemed to have vanished as completely as the people who had taken it. The case remained active for 3 years before being transferred to the Cold Case Division in 2000. By then, investigators had interviewed over 800 people, analyzed thousands of financial records, and followed up on hundreds of tips from the public. None had produced viable suspects or actionable leads. The file was officially reclassified as a suspended investigation, meaning it would remain open but would not receive active attention unless new evidence emerged. For the families of the guards who had been held at gunpoint, the lack of resolution was deeply frustrating. Both men had followed their training perfectly and cooperated fully with the investigation, yet they felt abandoned by a system that seemed unable to deliver justice. The psychological impact of the robbery affected their ability to continue working in security, and both eventually left the industry entirely. The stolen money, meanwhile, had presumably been integrated into Toronto's underground economy through a network of contacts and intermediaries that remained completely hidden from law enforcement. The crew had demonstrated not only the ability to execute a complex robbery, but also the discipline and connections necessary to launder such a large sum without detection. What no one anticipated was that 26 years later, a simple, mechanical inspection would uncover the first tangible evidence of what had really happened on that November morning in 1997. In March of 2023, Danny Kowalski had been working as an independent automotive mechanic for nearly 15 years. His small garage on Kingston Road specialized in fleet maintenance for local delivery companies and taxi services. The work was steady but unremarkable, involving routine oil changes, brake repairs, and the occasional engine overhaul. What made his business successful wasn't flashy advertising or premium location, but rather his reputation for thorough, honest work that kept vehicles running reliably. When the call came in about a decommissioned fuel truck that needed inspection before scrap disposal, Kowalski saw it as just another routine job. The vehicle belonged to a demolition company that was clearing out an old gas station property in Scarborough. The station had been closed since 2018, and the truck had been sitting unused in the back lot, slowly deteriorating under layers of rust and weather damage. Before the scrapyard would accept it, they needed a certified inspection to ensure all fuel systems had been properly drained and posed no environmental hazard. The truck itself was a 1994 Ford chassis, fitted with a standard commercial fuel tank. Nothing particularly noteworthy about its design or construction. It had originally been used for delivering heating oil to residential customers, a common sight throughout Toronto's suburban neighborhoods during the 1990s. The exterior showed the expected signs of long abandonment, with faded paint, corroded metal panels, and tires that had long since lost their structural integrity. Kowalski's inspection began with the standard checklist, examining the engine compartment, checking fluid levels, and testing the electrical systems. Most components showed the expected deterioration from years of exposure to the elements. The fuel pump was seized, the wiring harness had been compromised by rodents, and the hydraulic systems had leaked their contents onto the ground below. None of this was unusual for a vehicle that had been sitting idle for half a decade. The fuel tank itself required more detailed attention. Environmental regulations demanded that all petroleum residues be completely removed before disposal, and Kowalski needed to verify that the tank had been properly cleaned. Using a specialized vacuum pump, he began extracting the remaining contents, expecting to find the typical mixture of old fuel, water, and sediment that accumulated in abandoned tanks. What he discovered instead changed everything. Mixed in with the expected debris were several waterproof packages, each approximately the size of a paperback book and wrapped in multiple layers of heavy plastic. The packages had been secured inside the tank using a system of cables and anchors, positioned to remain stable even as fuel levels rose and fell during normal operation. They were designed to be retrieved only by someone who knew exactly where to look and how the concealment system worked. Kowalski's first instinct was to contact the demolition company, assuming the packages contained maintenance records or other documents related to the truck's operational history. But when he carefully opened one of the waterproof wrappings, he found not paperwork, but rather a collection of items that immediately raised serious questions. Inside were several expired identification cards bearing different names but the same photograph, a detailed hand-drawn map of downtown Toronto streets, and what appeared to be surveillance notes documenting the schedules and routes of various commercial vehicles. The identification cards were particularly troubling. They included employee badges for city maintenance departments, temporary contractor permits, and even what looked like security credentials for a major financial institution. All bore the same face, a middle-aged man with distinctive features, but each carried a different name and employment history. The quality of the forgeries was exceptional, suggesting access to professional document production equipment and considerable expertise in creating false identities. The map showed several Toronto intersections marked with precise timing notations and traffic pattern observations. Specific attention had been paid to the area around Bay and Adelaide streets, with detailed notes about sightlines, camera positions, and emergency response times. The handwriting was neat and methodical, indicating someone who approached planning with systematic precision and patience. But it was the surveillance notes that provided the most disturbing insights. Page after page documented the daily routines of armored car services, including departure times, route variations, and security protocols. The level of detail was extraordinary, covering everything from guard shift changes to vehicle maintenance schedules. Someone had invested months, possibly years, in gathering this intelligence with the thoroughness of a professional intelligence operation. Kowalski realized he was looking at evidence from a major crime, though he had no way of knowing which specific incident these materials related to. He carefully rewrapped the packages and contacted Toronto police, explaining that he had discovered suspicious items during a routine vehicle inspection. Within hours, detectives had secured the scene and begun a detailed examination of both the truck and its hidden contents. The waterproof packages were transported to the forensic laboratory for analysis, where technicians used specialized equipment to preserve and document every item. Fingerprint analysis revealed partial prints on several documents, though initial database searches failed to produce matches. The paper used for the maps and notes was traced to common office supply sources, providing no unique identifying information. What proved more valuable was the systematic comparison of the surveillance data with unsolved crimes from the Toronto area. Detectives began cross-referencing the documented routes and timing information with robbery cases that remained open in their files. The level of detail in the notes suggested they were connected to a specific planned operation, not general criminal intelligence gathering. The breakthrough came when investigators compared the Bay and Adelaide intersection markings with the case file from the 1997 Brinks truck robbery. The timing notations in the hidden documents matched exactly with the schedule the armored car had been following on the morning of November 14th. The surveillance notes described the same route, the same stops, and the same security procedures that had been exploited during the heist. Detective Sarah Chen, who had joined the cold case unit just 2 years earlier, was assigned to lead the renewed investigation. She had built her reputation by applying modern forensic techniques to older cases, often finding connections that previous investigators had missed. The discovery of the surveillance materials gave her something no one had possessed for 26 years: a direct link to the planning phase of the robbery. Chen's first step was to have the identification cards examined by document specialists who could determine their age and origin. Carbon dating of the paper and analysis of the printing techniques confirmed that the cards had been produced in the mid-1990s, consistent with the timeline of the Brinks heist. The photographic quality and lamination methods matched those used by legitimate government agencies during that period, suggesting the forger had access to official equipment or materials. The photograph itself became the focus of intensive analysis. Facial recognition software was used to compare the image with databases of known criminals, though the technology's limitations with older photographs meant the results were far from conclusive. The image was also enhanced and aged using computer modeling to show how the individual might appear decades later. More promising was the handwriting analysis of the surveillance notes. Forensic graphologists compared the penmanship with samples from the original investigation, including witness statements and police reports. While no direct matches were found, the analysis revealed distinctive characteristics that could potentially be linked to future discoveries. The fuel truck's ownership history provided another avenue for investigation. Records showed it had been purchased in 1996 by a small heating oil delivery company that operated in the eastern suburbs of Toronto. The business had been sold in 1999, 2 years after the robbery, and had changed hands several times before finally being abandoned at the gas station property. Chen tracked down the original owner, now retired and living in Mississauga. Frank Martinelli had operated Martinelli Fuel Services for over 30 years before selling the business to focus on his health. When questioned about the truck, he remembered it as one of his most reliable vehicles, though he admitted his record-keeping had been somewhat informal during the company's final years. What Martinelli couldn't explain was how surveillance materials had ended up hidden in the fuel tank. He insisted that the truck had been used exclusively for legitimate deliveries and had never been involved in any suspicious activities. His employment records showed a small crew of drivers, all of whom had been with the company for several years and had seemed trustworthy. The investigation took on new urgency as Chen realized that she might be dealing with an inside job that was far more sophisticated than anyone had previously suspected. The fuel truck had provided the perfect cover for transporting stolen money, allowing the crew to move large amounts of cash through the city without attracting attention from law enforcement. But the hidden packages suggested something even more disturbing. This hadn't been a one-time operation, but rather part of a larger criminal enterprise that had used the heating oil business as a front for planning and executing multiple robberies. The level of preparation indicated that the 1997 Brinks heist might have been just one of several jobs carried out by the same professional crew. The scope of Chen's investigation expanded as she began connecting the heating oil company to other unsolved crimes from the same period. A pattern emerged when she cross-referenced Martinelli Fuel Services delivery routes with robbery locations throughout the Greater Toronto Area. Between 1995 and 1999, 7 high-value thefts had occurred within 2 kilometers of areas regularly serviced by the company's trucks. The proximity wasn't conclusive evidence, but it suggested a level of operational planning that went far beyond the single Brinks heist. Chen requested archived surveillance footage from businesses along the fuel company's delivery routes, though most recordings from the 1990s had long since been destroyed or recorded over. What remained was a handful of grainy security tapes from gas stations and convenience stores that showed Martinelli trucks making routine deliveries. The drivers appeared normal, following standard procedures for fuel delivery, nothing that would have attracted attention at the time. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Among Martinelli's former employees was a driver named Robert Tessier, who had worked for the company from 1994 to 1998. Tessier had left Toronto shortly after the Brinks robbery and had been living in Vancouver under a slightly different name. When Chen finally located him through employment records and social insurance number traces, she discovered he had been working as a security guard at a shopping mall, maintaining a clean record with no criminal activity since leaving Ontario. Tessier agreed to meet with investigators, though he initially claimed to remember little about his time with the fuel company. He described Martinelli as a fair employer who ran a legitimate business and insisted he had never been involved in anything illegal. His answers were careful, measured, and seemed rehearsed, as if he had been expecting this conversation for decades. But when Chen showed him photographs of the surveillance materials found in the fuel tank, Tessier's demeanor shifted. He stared at the images for several minutes without speaking, his hands trembling slightly as he held the printouts. When he finally looked up, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said he recognized the handwriting, though he claimed not to know whose it was. The pressure of the interview, combined with Chen's patient but persistent questioning, eventually broke through Tessier's defenses. He admitted that during his final year with Martinelli Fuel, he had noticed irregularities in the delivery schedules. Certain routes were handled exclusively by one driver, a man named Michael Durand, who had joined the company in late 1995. Durand kept to himself, rarely socializing with other employees, and seemed to have an unusual interest in the technical aspects of the fuel trucks. According to Tessier, Durand had modified several vehicles without authorization, claiming the changes would improve fuel efficiency. These modifications included alterations to the tank access systems and the installation of additional compartments that weren't part of the original design. At the time, Tessier had assumed these were legitimate improvements, but looking back, he realized they could have been used for concealment purposes. Durand had also displayed knowledge that seemed beyond what a fuel delivery driver would normally possess. He understood traffic patterns throughout the city with remarkable precision, could predict police response times to various neighborhoods, and seemed familiar with the security procedures used by banks and armored car services. When other drivers asked how he knew such things, he claimed to have worked in security before joining the fuel company. The connection between Durand and the Brinks robbery became clearer as Tessier recalled specific conversations from 1997. In the weeks leading up to the heist, Durand had been particularly interested in armored car schedules, asking casual questions about when such vehicles typically made their rounds through downtown Toronto. He had also requested route changes that would take him through the financial district more frequently, claiming he wanted to service customers in that area more efficiently. Most significantly, Tessier remembered that Durand had taken several days off work around the time of the robbery, claiming he needed to handle family business out of town. When he returned, he seemed different, more relaxed and confident, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Within months, he had left the fuel company entirely, claiming he was moving to Alberta for better opportunities. Chen immediately launched a comprehensive search for Michael Durand, though she suspected this was likely an alias. The name appeared in Martinelli Fuel's employment records, but the personal information provided at the time of hiring led to dead ends. The address was a rooming house that had been demolished years earlier. The social insurance number belonged to someone who had died in childhood, and the references were either fictional or untraceable. What Chen could verify was that someone using that identity had worked for the fuel company for approximately 3 years, had access to the modified trucks, and had possessed detailed knowledge of Toronto's transportation infrastructure. Bank records showed that wages had been deposited into an account that was closed shortly after the employee's departure, with the remaining balance withdrawn in cash. The investigation took on new momentum as forensic accountants joined the team to trace financial patterns that might reveal where the stolen money had ended up. The Brinks heist had involved predominantly small bills that would have been difficult to track through traditional banking systems, but large cash transactions often left other traces in the form of property purchases, business investments, or luxury acquisitions. Chen's team began examining real estate transactions, vehicle purchases, and business registrations from the years immediately following the robbery. They were looking for cash buyers who had made significant acquisitions without obvious income sources, particularly individuals who had appeared suddenly in Toronto's business community during the late 1990s. The search revealed several suspicious transactions, including the cash purchase of a downtown restaurant by someone with no previous experience in the hospitality industry, the acquisition of multiple rental properties by buyers with minimal credit histories, and the establishment of several small businesses that had operated briefly before disappearing without trace. Each transaction shared common characteristics that suggested systematic money laundering operations. One pattern that emerged was particularly intriguing. Several of the suspicious purchases had been made through the same law firm, a small practice that specialized in real estate transactions for cash buyers. The firm had handled dozens of deals during the late 1990s, many involving clients who preferred to remain anonymous and who conducted business exclusively through intermediaries. When Chen contacted the law firm, she discovered it had been dissolved in 2001, with its records transferred to a storage facility before eventually being destroyed according to standard retention policies. The senior partner had died several years earlier, and the remaining staff had scattered to other practices throughout the city. None of the former employees Chen was able to locate claimed to remember specific details about cash transactions from over 2 decades earlier. However, one retired paralegal recalled unusual activity during that period. She described clients who would arrive at the office carrying briefcases full of cash, who insisted on using assumed names for property purchases, and who seemed unusually concerned about avoiding any paper trails that might connect them to their acquisitions. The paralegal had assumed this was simply wealthy individuals seeking privacy, but in retrospect, she acknowledged the behavior had been suspicious. The breakthrough in tracing the money came from an unexpected source. During a routine audit of a Toronto construction company in 2023, Revenue Canada investigators discovered financial irregularities dating back to the late 1990s. The company had reported substantial cash revenues during that period, without corresponding records of where the money had originated. When questioned, current management claimed the records from that era had been lost in an office fire years earlier. But buried in backup files was a series of deposit slips showing large cash payments from unnamed clients for construction projects that were never completed. The amounts were consistent with someone attempting to launder stolen money through a legitimate business, converting cash into reportable income, while creating a plausible explanation for sudden wealth. The construction company's owner during that period was a man named Vincent Romano, who had sold the business in 2000 and moved to Florida. Romano had purchased the company with cash in 1996, despite having no previous experience in construction. His background check revealed a history of minor criminal activity, including several arrests for fraud and theft, though he had never been convicted of any major crimes. When Chen tracked Romano to his current address in Miami, she found him living in a modest retirement community, maintaining a low profile and claiming to be surviving on a small pension. He initially denied any knowledge of suspicious financial activity, insisting that his construction business had been completely legitimate and that any cash payments had come from customers who preferred to avoid bank transactions. But as the interview progressed, Romano's story began to unravel. He couldn't explain how he had acquired the initial capital to purchase the construction company, couldn't provide records of the major projects that had supposedly generated substantial revenues, and couldn't account for the sudden sale of the business just a few years after acquiring it. His answers became increasingly evasive, as Chen pressed for specific details about his operations during the late 1990s. The pressure finally broke Romano's resistance when Chen presented him with copies of the surveillance materials found in the fuel truck. Upon seeing the photographs and maps, Romano's composure collapsed entirely. He admitted that he had been approached in 1997 by someone claiming to have access to large amounts of cash that needed to be converted into legitimate assets. The man had offered Romano a substantial commission to process the money through his construction business, creating false invoices and project records to justify the income. Romano described his contact as a professional who understood both criminal operations and legitimate business practices. The man had provided detailed instructions on how to structure the transactions to avoid detection, had supplied false documentation to support the cover story, and had maintained strict operational security throughout their relationship. Romano had never learned his real name, knew nothing about the source of the money, and had been instructed to avoid asking questions about details that didn't concern him. The arrangement had lasted approximately 2 years, during which Romano had processed nearly $2 million through his construction company. He had kept detailed records of the transactions, hidden in a safety deposit box that he maintained even after moving to Florida. The records showed systematic money laundering on a scale that matched the amount stolen in the Brinks robbery, providing the first concrete evidence of where the missing funds had ended up. Chen's investigation had finally connected the fuel truck surveillance materials to the money laundering operation, establishing a clear chain of evidence that linked the planning phase of the robbery to its aftermath. The case was no longer just about identifying the perpetrators of a single heist, but about unraveling a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had operated across multiple businesses and jurisdictions.